Good afternoon, everybody. But first of all, I just want to say thank you very much for turning up. I appreciate it takes quite a bit of effort for many of you to come into London. Also, just to put up with this fabulous, overdone room. It's not to everybody's taste, but we really appreciate it as a firm. The other thing that we're going to do slightly differently, based on feedback last time, is obviously there was quite a lot of talk in the afternoon, went on for a fair bit of time last time. So this time around, we're actually going to start off with my presentation, and then you don't have to pay attention. Well, you don't even have to pay attention now if you don't want. At the end of the day, you are the clients. But you're free to get on with your lunch. So I totally understand. I'm standing between you and a good lunch, and as you can see from my winter-honed physique, there's not many times that I've gone past and not done that myself. So title for this, as you know, I'm a bit of a fan for old song lyrics. So we've got Cha-Cha Changes. I'll attempt to not sing it for you. But the point we want to make with our presentation is we think there's going to be a lot more echoes of the 1970s going forwards. So we think actually for the next few years, there's a couple of key things where you're going to get this echo coming through. So what am I going to cover? Why we think the 70s are going to come through. Some faulty memories, because as you know, we like, for all the reputation we have for a sort of artificial intelligence, we actually do encode a lot of behaviorism in there. So you'll be glad to hear that we've got some audience participation. And we've also got then some of the big trends that we think are going to influence markets. So my boss, Jason, who runs the overall parent company, put a good piece out on LinkedIn saying why some of these trends have just actually turned up. And then I'm just going to talk through where we think the market is, and then just explain what we're doing for you and your portfolio and everything else. I mean, hopefully everyone that's client has seen the performance recently, and we'll explain what we've done slightly differently and why we did things slightly differently in the last couple of months. So we all remember the 70s. Well, I don't really. I do remember the Muppets. I also vaguely remember bin strikes because I was born in that era. But obviously other people have better knowledge for me. But you've got some of these famous images about what went through. You had some terrible fashion, some questionable music, some great movies. You've obviously got Nixon up in the corner, regretting perhaps ever coming into détente with the Chinese. You've got obviously the evacuation of Saigon. And in the bottom right-hand corner there, you've got the British Cabinet, the State Opener Parliament, showing that one thing never changes, which is the quality of our politicians. Now, we all look back and we'll pick some of these images from the 1970s. We'll have our personal memories and there'll be those collective memories. But the problem that you have is human memory is faulty. And one of those things why you get this faulty human memory is something called the Mandela effect. It's called the Mandela effect because a sizable percentage of the US population remembers Nelson Mandela dying in prison in the 1980s. That might say quite a lot about US current affairs knowledge, but the effect is real. We do get flawed memories, and that's the title that actually they came up with. Now, I've got two sort of famous things here. So on the left-hand side, we've got the famous film Casablanca, and it's known for a couple of lines out of it. Can anybody volunteer those lines? Play it again, Sam. So we all know it said play it again. He never actually says that. But that's the thing, if you were to say one line from that film, the one that everybody would know. So the collective memory is, that's actually what is said in the film. Freddie Mercury, looking particularly butch in his 1970s prime. We Are the Champions. So, We Are the Champions, a record. We've all heard it. We know how it goes. How does it end? We are the champions. We are the champions of the world. Doesn't say it. Listen to it. You've heard that record probably dozens, if not hundreds of times, and it does not finish. He just finishes on We Are the Champions. The only time he does sing that is at Live Aid. And that's the one way everybody remembers it. So even though that's not actually the evidence, the collective memory is the one that we all kind of remember. I've got a couple of ones for you here. So audience, again, participation. Is it Looney Tunes or Looney Tunes? Right, hands up for tunes. Okay. Hands up for tunes. And split audience. Okay. It's tunes. That makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. Tunes makes far more sense to my mind, but it's actually Looney Tunes. Below, we've got the capitalist from the Monopoly game. As you can see, like most capitalists at the moment in the Western world, he's trying to run away with his money before he gets taxed by Jeremy Hunt. The big question is, does the capitalist have a monocle, or does he not have a monocle? So he doesn't have a monocle. Right, the opposite of all this is where people deliberately try to make you forget things, that they don't want you to remember, and they'll try and obscure them. I've got 3, and I know this gets recorded, and it actually gets a big pickup in the audience, so apologies on the recording. These are all British politicians, so I'll explain who they are. Actually, for most of the audience, I probably have to explain who the first person is on the left-hand side anyway. But that is Ed Davey, the leader of our third party in Parliament at the moment. Ed Davey really wants you to fail to remember that he used to run the post office when most of the Horizon scandal happened. So that's Ed's big mission. We're in the middle. We've got almost certainly our next Prime Minister, who's absolutely desperate that you forget that he campaigned for Jeremy Corbyn, who's obviously he's kicked out of the party, and the fact that Keir promised his party he was going to stand on 10 left-wing principles, all of which he's promptly binned. But probably the all-time champion is Rishi Sunak, who really wants you to forget that his party's been in power for 14 years, and most of the expenditure that went wrong was actually caused under his reign when he was the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And as I explained last time, he's desperate to try and blame all of that on Liz Truss. I don't think it's going to work for him, but there you've got 3 individuals desperately trying to distance themselves. So the key point is, certain individuals, you'll have certain events, you'll have failed memory recollection. You may well have picked up on what is in the public conscience. And you've also got a bunch of individuals, whether it's in business or usually politics, that really want you to forget about what happened in the past. And this is important for when you look at the current financial conditions in the market. So the 3 big themes I wanted to run through. As you can see, there's demographics, data, and debt. I could have put some other things in there, but I like the fact having 3 Ds in there, and it makes my life simple, and I'm a simple individual. So the first one is we've all known that the population is aging, but I don't think people appreciate how quickly it is aging. So this data here, as you can see from the United Nations, you can see that Europe is really aging at an accelerated rate. But also, we have got this uptick over the next few years against a bunch of different countries. Now, the UK is actually not that bad in a developed world country. The people who are really in trouble in terms of demographics is China, because of the one-child policy finally catching up with them. Korea, which everybody forgets about, that's absolutely on. If you're looking at countries around the world that's got one of the fastest decelerations in terms of population, it's Korea. For whatever reason, they've decided to have a massively reduced birth rate. Obviously, Japan is obviously well known, but even in Europe, you've got countries like Germany, you've got countries like Italy that really are towards global extremes. The UK is relatively better because obviously there's quite a lot of immigration going on, and that's one of the things that benefits Oceania and North America. But they've all got similar problems. You've got this enormous demographic going through in terms of society, it's aging, and none of it was provisioned for. So what does this actually mean? Well, anybody that knows the OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility, has taken on fabulous new high profile. That's Helen Thomas, who I'll introduce later on there, who's a political expert. But the OBR now runs the country, as we've discovered. So the OBR, despite being consistently wrong on a lot of its projections, does actually give you some data about what the national debt means. So the UK tries to not go beyond 90% debt to GDP. So now you see essentially what Hunt has been trying to do. He's been trying to at least stabilise the debt load, because as we go forward in time, it's going to start picking up. But that assumes everything goes to plan. So if you kind of look at all these various other scenarios, and perhaps most important is the baseline with shocks, so that's things like a banking collapse, an unexpected war, obviously COVID, they're exactly the kind of things that come along. So history tells you, actually, it's probably not going to be the best case, might be the base case, but there's a high chance that we're going to have the unexpected coming through. And the problem that you've got is we can't afford it. There's no way the country clearly is going to get to 400% debt to GDP over the next 30, 40 years. Obviously, as a Scot myself, I don't need to worry about pension plans and longevity, but I'm on the final run myself. But there may well be people in there, and obviously if you're setting up inheritances and things like that, you do need to consider that the government is going to carry on looking for money. And then the next problem you've got is we're not the only one. So I've given you the US, the Eurozone, and the UK. So this is the budget balance. So that's kind of how much are they borrowing year on year. And you can see across the sort of three major blocks in the Western world, all of them are borrowing money at the moment. And they're all going and accelerating their debt loading, with the sole exception of Germany. Germany is interesting because, again, it's got very poor demographics. There is some of the money had been effectively put aside in terms of sort of national savings. As you know, they're fairly prudent. But unfortunately, they're then going into the Eurozone. So if you look at the Eurozone economy, on one side of it, you've got a lot of aging populations. A lot of countries like Italy and France, they've got growing debt loads, and they haven't provisioned for it. And effectively, Germany on the other side, which has been effectively financing it. So again, not fantastic for them in the medium to long term, even though they look relatively prudent. At the far end, you've already got the extremes with regards to Japan, and obviously Italy is another famous one that we often get people talking about because, again, aging population, economically stagnant, and a lot of debt. However, the Americans like to do everything bigger and better, and as you can see here from the data here, that America is just about to basically overtake Italy in terms of debt, which, as you can see where they started off 24 years ago, is a fairly impressive achievement. So even in the case of the Italians, where they've managed to keep the debt loading relatively stable for periods of time, though obviously every time there's a shock that's come through, they've been forced up, the Americans have absolutely gone for it. So one of the reasons why the United States is having such fantastic growth at the moment is because they are effectively borrowing a lot of money to do it. And as you can see, they've got absolutely no plans whatsoever to pay any of it back. So I put it to you that one of the things that's probably going to happen that's going to be an echo of the 1970s is we're going to have a fiscal crisis. So one of the things that happened to the British in 76 is we had to go to the IMF. Different world, but we had to go to the IMF to basically get financing because our finances were in such desperate states. Obviously, the United States is one of the main guarantors of the IMF, so I put it to you, they're probably not able to go to the IMF because the IMF isn't big enough. But at some stage or another, there's a high probability that the market is going to say enough is enough, and you are going to have a bit like the trust moment where the bond market just backs up and says, you know, this doesn't work, you have to sort your finances out. And you can see, in terms of the Americans, one of the biggest problems they've got is one of the biggest things that's going to ramp up is how much interest they have to pay. And this is actually accelerated because one of the things the US decided to do last year was borrow very aggressively, effectively with an overdraft facility or short-term credit financing. So they picked the most expensive point of financing, the most expensive rate, in the hope that their interest rates would go down. So it's a little bit like you're living next to somebody, they're spending on the high hog with the credit card bill, it looks great, everybody that's selling them stuff thinks they're great people, this is exactly the lifestyle you want, this is where you want to be, but then the bill starts to turn up. And that's one of the fundamental issues that we've got at the moment, that we think, while the UK had elements of fiscal crisis in the 70s, we think that you're going to have more of these going forward over the next few years. To give you an idea what those numbers mean, so the US is now borrowing $1 trillion every 100 days. And I've given you another stat at the bottom, so those with a good enough mental arithmetic could work out exactly how long my talk is going to take. And did I actually time it so it would get to a round number, or was it just pure chance? But yeah, this lunch is going to have cost the US taxpayer an extra $140 million, just my speaking period of it. Basically, if you want to go for the long lunch and perhaps join us for a beer afterwards, we'll be over the $1 billion mark, which I feel is what the founding fathers would have wanted us to do. And the other problem that you have with the United States, it is the world's biggest economy, but it's also the world's biggest debtor. And as you can see, it's rapidly coming to the point, especially with their borrowing, where they're effectively going to owe more money than just about everybody else combined. So at some point, you are going to have a problem. At some point, the bond market is either going to ask for higher interest rates to compensate for this, which, as you can see, will accelerate the problems that they have, because it's a bit like your credit card bill's interest bill component going up. Or the bond market's just going to say, I'm not going to finance this. Now, when does this occur? I have absolutely no idea. Could it be the US election this year in November? We've obviously got Donald Trump, who's promising even more tax cuts, and he's also promising that he's going to fire Jerome Powell, who's the Federal Reserve Governor. Now, I'm not an expert, But normally, when you fire a bank manager and you're a serial bankrupt yourself, it's not normally a good indicator that you're going to take things seriously and start sorting things out. So it may well be that we get another uptick in the equity market because everybody thinks this is great, more tax cuts, more borrowing, but the bond market takes a very, very different view of it. The only difference effectively between him and Biden is just the rate of borrowing. Trump plans to accelerate it to grow even quicker, and Biden plans to carry on doing it. Well, I'm not sure Biden does know what he plans to do, but at least according to the people, his handlers say that he's going to carry on borrowing the money at a fairer rate, and they're hoping that they're going to get paid back later on. The key thing is when you add this all together is ultimately whatever happens on all the current projections, slowly but surely, AAA, which is the highest quality and often government debt, is declining, and the amount of speculative debt in the world, so that stuff where there's a reasonable element that you're not going to get paid back, is going to increase. And the problem that you have, this leads to an effect called crowding out. So as the government borrows more and more money, and usually wherever you are in the world tends to spend it badly, they are effectively going to have to start paying more interest for it, and they are going to have to start issuing more debt. And the question you would have is, if you've got government bonds paying you 6, 7, 8% or something like that, what are you going to put what interest rate will you accept off your local bank? Would you put your money into Barclays, for instance, at 5% when the government's paying you 7%? No. So Barclays will have to offer you more money to compensate. To offset that, somebody like Barclays or NatWest will have to charge their customers even more. So you get this slow ratcheting up, squeezing effect of the economy, and they call that crowding out. So as you can see, we've got that kind of pressure cooker build at the moment. But it's not all terrible. And for anybody that was here last time, Lawrence Dallaglio did one of the speeches. He listened to my conversation and said I should never do a team talk. So I decided to put something here that's a little bit more positive. So we've had these problems in the past, and actually if you look back, and there's a very interesting book called The Science of Fear and Risk by somebody called Dan Gardner, and it is very easy to make negative projections about the future. We are just hardwired into kind of looking for the worst case scenario because that's part of our survival instinct. But the reality is there's always been opportunities to get concerned about things. Yes, financial crises have happened before. The UK had one in 76, and then it was in the middle of a boom 10 years later. So things do get to correct themselves. But the other one that people always underestimate is the impact of technology. And that's good because you can see here that we are going through a technological boom at the moment. Now, the book that this comes from, I don't recommend, unless you're having great problems sleeping. It is a very interesting book, but it is an academic book. But effectively, technology revolutions come in 2 stages. So the best way to think of a recent one was the internet. So you get the first stage of the internet, the technology comes in, everybody turns around and says, this is going to change the world. Everybody overinvests, there's a financial panic, everybody goes, this is a disaster. A lot of firms say, oh, well, we didn't have to pay any attention to this. And actually, they should have paid attention to it because then the second stage comes along, and that's where kind of big retailers like Woolworths or Macy's and States go out of business because actually everything starts to shift on the internet and you didn't take it seriously. So we think that's a high chance of where you are at the moment in terms of AI because it fits in with the previous, because you can see there's a fair amount of overlap between the previous technological innovation allowed the next one to come through, which then allowed an even steeper curve as it was building on more and more technology. So do we think at the moment there is a bit of an AI bubble going on at the moment? Yes. Do we think everybody will not take it seriously when a bust finally occurs? Probably. But we suspect that actually once you get through that stage, you're going to end up with a lot of new companies and new bits of innovation. So yes, there are opportunities to actually reduce the debt and improve the problems. It's going to be a mixture of things. We're probably at the limit of taxation at the moment, which is one of the things that happened in the 1970s. We're probably going to have a fair amount of cuts to the state, which was obviously one of the things that happened starting in the 1980s. But we're also going to have the impact of a relatively powerful new technology coming through. So one of the less reported things in the budget this week was the government set aside $3.5 billion for productivity improvements for the NHS. Don't laugh. But that's what they did, and apparently they're going to bring in AI, and it's going to generate about $35 billion. Do I think it'll achieve $35 billion in productivity improvements? Probably not, but I think there's a reasonable chance it will do something. And as the technology comes in, it gets better and better. So we do have that. So what does that mean for the market at the moment? So I saw this diagram from one of the big global private equity firms, and I thought this was very useful. So last year, we were talking about the lagged effects of Fed hikes. So as I've said before, interest rates act on the economy with long and variable lags. That's the official language from the Federal Reserve and, in fact, pretty much all other central banks. So we know the higher interest rates are coming through. We can see that in the UK from mortgage rates. We can see it with some of the bank borrowing rates if you're basically taking out small company loans. But at the same time, we've got two other opposite forces. So last October, going into November, the Federal Reserve basically indicated they were going to cut interest rates much quicker and sooner than everybody thought. So that triggered a lot of easing of financial conditions. And at the same time, you have got the US government spending a huge amount of money. Now, we might argue that it's not well spent, but the fact is, spending 6 or 7% of your GDP, so effectively the sort of national income, and then pumping it straight into the economy, is enormously stimulative. If you're going to add tax cuts to that as well, assuming that the bond market is prepared to underwrite that for a period of time, you are likely to get a re-acceleration of growth. And you are also likely to get a re-acceleration of inflation. One of the things that happened in the 1970s was you got a burst of inflation at the end of the Vietnam War, and when the US came off the gold standard, interest rates came up. Everybody thought this is going to deal with the problem. They cut early because there was an election cycle with Richard Nixon. They cut too soon, and then you got a re-acceleration of inflation, which means that usually second time round, the interest rates have to be even higher because effectively the bond market doesn't believe you anymore. So to absolutely stamp it out because you've already added to inflation on inflation, you are going to have to go to a higher rate. One of the reasons, talking about false memories and politicians wanting to forget things, one of the reasons why we haven't done that kind of financing for the government, fiscal stimulus they call it, is because it caused a lot of the problems in the 1970s. So one of the things that we had at the end of the 70s and into the 80s was very high interest rates to stamp that out and an aggressive cutback on what the governments could spend because the bond markets had had basically enough and inflation rates had got too high. We now appear to be repeating that, where at least the central banks are beginning to take things seriously, but politicians aren't. And like I say, that was one of the things that contributed to problems in the 70s. There is a reason why we haven't done this for nearly 50 years. So what did we do? Well, we kind of repositioned the portfolio, and I'll explain later on, but the key thing was that behaviour by the central banks told you that they are not serious about it. They are more interested in keeping things afloat than actually dealing with inflation and dealing with problems. And the problem with this is you've already got very aggressive valuations in the US stock market. And as we know, our portfolios are all globally diversified. We pick a mixture of companies for various qualities. And as you also know, we've got almost none of the Magnificent Seven, though we're almost down to the Magnificent Two now. They're almost like one of those pyramids that you find in corporate strategy, where as you get close to the top, fewer people can make it. So we're beginning to see some of those 7 companies that propelled the stock market last year beginning to falter, most notably Tesla, which is not a huge surprise to me for various reasons. But the key thing is you have got this key clustering, and it's almost at the same level as when we saw the last big technological first stage kind of thing going through with the dot-com bubble. So you've got a small number of companies that have got really excessive valuations, and when you compare both sides of it, you can see that the US stock market is pretty much at the same point. However, that doesn't make much difference in the short term. Just because something's really expensive doesn't mean it can't get even more expensive. And for anybody that's been here before, we explained about how bubbles work, how people hate to be seen missing out on the action, how people like to kind of get invested because everybody else is perceived to be getting richer. So I've got these charts from some organisation called JP Morgan. Allegedly, they're quite reputable. But on one side, you can see with the charts, it says that basically in the short term, it doesn't really matter what stock market valuations are. There's not a strong correlation year on year. But as you know, we like maths, we like probability. One of the things that Morgan shows is you kind of go forward over 10 years, they do actually matter. And again, for anybody that's been at one of the previous presentations, it was one of the reasons I used a Warren Buffett quote saying in the short term, the stock market is a voting machine, but in the medium term, it's a weighing machine. And that's exactly the process that he's talking about. So people are paying a lot of money that you know at some point isn't going to come through and justify the earnings. Now, before you all panic, I've also taken this chart from JP Morgan, and you can see it's the reason why you own equities. I know I've used different versions of this. I've used different examples about why it's worth, if you want growth, staying invested in equities. Because even though there is a lot of volatility, it does actually pay you off in time. You get paid for that volatility if you've got a decent portfolio. Cash, not so much. And even with bonds, which everybody tells you they're safe, you can see they've actually had some terrible bear markets. Just there, perhaps if I use the laser pointer, is just without blinding anybody. But the first big blue dip is after the First World War. So what happened? Huge amount of debt raised, which they decided they had to pay off one way or the other. Second big dip starts around 1943, and it lasts through to 1980, with effectively a long bond bear market. Again, large amount of debt suddenly raised, one way or the other. The US has to get out of it. And again, in the last few years, we've had another acceleration in terms of debt returns, but it started to turn around, oddly enough, just after a huge amount of debt's been raised, and people are beginning to wonder about how it's going to be paid off. So one of the key takeaways for us here is there might be value in bonds short term. For a certain interest rate, it might be worth considering, but over the medium term, they're not necessarily core holdings for your portfolio going forward. They are things that you temporarily hold, in our opinion, and we think that you probably should start thinking about accepting a slightly more volatile but better probability portfolio in terms of longer term capital growth. So that's the kind of key things. Every time we've seen a problem, whether it was SVB, whether it was the bond yields, whether it was Liz Truss, the central banks have come in and basically bailed out the system. So you can see, talking about the behaviorism I did at the beginning, which is one of the key things with Henderson Rowe's investment strategy, the revealed preference. So it's do as I say, not do as I do. The revealed preference is for inflation. The current status quo is unsustainable. We are heading for a crisis, but that could be 2 years away, it could be 3 years away, we don't know. But in the meantime, that revealed preference for getting out of their problems, for injecting cash in the economy, basically leaves us with a stock market that's likely to be buoyant for a few more months at least. And who knows, maybe it might stretch into 2025 because they haven't completely exhausted the country credit card just yet. Politics are going to get a lot more confrontational, as you can see. One of the problems you're going to have with the UK is obviously Labour is likely to get in. Everybody thinks it's going to be like 1997. Usually Labour is a party of tax and spend. Well, we've already had a huge amount of taxation, which means that their ability to spend things is also going to be extremely limited. We also only had about 39% debt to GDP. In 1997. Now, as you can see from those charts, we're nearly over 100%, which also means the capacity for the party to do anything different is going to be very hard. And I suspect a lot of their voters, and even more particularly their members, are going to have real difficulty with that. So I think just as the same way that the Tories have dissented into their kind of various factions, I think there's a high chance that Labour's going to move into its factions. Now, I have also got an expert in the room here for anybody that wants to talk politics. So I will be at the end of the room after the meal for anybody that wants to have a chat. But I've got Helen Thomas, who runs Blonde Money. You've probably seen her. She's on television a lot. Helen runs a political risk consultancy that I used to use in my former life and we use at the moment for Henderson Rowe to try and put real probabilistic values for various outcomes, whether it's sort of Brexit, whether it's kind of key votes. Helen, also, you worked for George Osborne. You were also at university with Rishi Sunak. Same course, same college, same time, wasn't it, as I recall? This is recorded, so Helen, I'm sure, would want to have any of those conversations off. And the final key thing is there's huge technological shift going on, but it's going to be very disruptive. So what have we done with your portfolio? We've again kept the duration, so that's the period of time that we are prepared to hold bonds for in terms of their life of the bonds, relatively short, because we get paid to have that. The US economy, and to a certain extent the UK economy, is borrowing aggressively using short-term financing, and we're happy to take the opposite side of that. We have slightly shifted your portfolio to take advantage of what we think are final stage conditions, the liquidity they've re-injected into the market, and you can see that's caused a significant uplift in performance over the last 2 or 3 months. but we are also remaining cautious. So you can see that we continue to have globally diversified names, and we are spending obviously a lot of time trying to pick up some of the value. So the good thing is, while everybody else is focused on the Magnificent 2 or the Magnificent 7 as it used to be, there is a lot of value beginning to occur elsewhere. Now, the other thing that we wanted you to remember about when you do get these periods of technological change, you do get these periods of financial disruption, often you get amazing companies coming out of it. So we've got Apple with their old logo, Atari, which a few people might remember, both run by basically drug-addled hippies, but basically one of them cleaned their act up and created the world's biggest company. The other one didn't, but I'm sure he had a lot more fun during it. Obviously, Atari got bought. Starbucks, Microsoft with its old logo, and FedEx and Oracle. On this side of the pond, we had Virgin, the powerhouse that is J.D. Wetherspoon. I'm not sure you are traditional J.D. Wetherspoon type customers, but if you feel the need to go in, don't. And we had something called Am Summers, which I've got absolutely no idea what they do. But the key thing is perhaps even then we could start seeing there might have been a difference with priorities and technological development on both sides of the Atlantic. While the Americans were creating Microsoft and Oracle and Apple, we basically got cheap flights, cheap booze, and cheap thrills. And before I jump off and do that, just one last thing. We normally have a charity speaker, but again, we try to cut down in terms of time, so I will come back to this. But this year, I'm doing a charity walk, though I'm doing it with a load of Army veterans that I served with, so it's more likely to be a charity march, whether I want to or not, for the ABF, which is the Army Benevolent Fund. So we did want to get them in today, but with the aims of keeping everything shorter. So one of the things I'm going to do is we're going to go over the Pyrenees using the escape route that the Allied airmen used in the Second World War, but also the Army's very keen to promote basically awareness of some of the sectarian politics that are going on, because it was also used for Jewish escapees. So the Army is basically also highlighting that, because obviously it's a key thing that they've been involved in for years. So anybody that's interested, any donations kindly taken. And with that, I thank you very much. Just quickly to say, because our compliance officer is in here, as I always say to you, you cannot trust a single thing that I say. None of this should be relied on, and everything can go wrong, and I'm completely irresponsible, but now legally free. So, with that, I will leave you with those fine, fine individuals. Thank you very much.